Hello and welcome to another Portland Cocktail Week distance learning session. I am so excited because we have two of my very favorite human beings with me today to talk about one of the greatest bourbons in the world. So it's going to be a really fun hour with these two beautiful people who I'm not going to tell you who they are just yet, although their names are on there. We're going to talk about them in just a second. Before we get into the class, I just want to remind everybody about what we're here doing today. All right, so this is Four Roses, the Art of Mingling. As a lot of you know, Four Roses has all of these 10 amazing recipes that they use to mingle and match to make the perfect bottle of bourbon. So we're going to talk a lot today about how that happens, how it comes together, and the amazing process in which we get that bottle of bourbon. I'm sure a lot of you know there's a little Four Roses gift pack that went out to 25 of our top scorers on the quiz just a couple of weeks ago. So congratulations to everyone who got their hands on one of those gift packs. They are amazing. We also had 100 friends get a Four Roses Portland Cocktail Week sweatshirt. So this has been a really fun, present-filled experience for everybody, which I love. If you missed out, it's probably because you don't subscribe to our newsletter. So get over to pdxcw.com/newsletter after the class. Make sure you're all signed up so you have first dibs on all of those cool prizes. Also, make sure you subscribe here at Portland Cocktail Week or Camp Run Amok here on Facebook. You can also head over to YouTube if you prefer that. youtube.com/pdxcw is going to have all of the content, all of the info, and all of the news that you're going to need to get your hands on some Four Roses and all kinds of other goodies around here. All right, so let's get to the important stuff. All right, we have Master Distiller of the Year, Brent Elliott, with us yet again. So make sure you are getting all of your questions ready because I know you've got a lot of them. You've been sending them to me. I want you to get all those questions ready and drop them here in the comments so we can get them over to Brent at the end of the show. And of course, we have the fantastic Abby Martinie, who I know many of you have met over the years, whether it's during her illustrious bar career or maybe you met her at Camp Run Amok when she was probably covered in trash juice because she worked on that A-team a lot. She kept a lot of us, she kept things going for a long time at camp, and we appreciate her for that. But the two of them are maybe two of the smartest people I know. So I am just going to pass it over to you two. Talk to us. Tell us about the art of mingling.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction, Lindsay. We're both really excited to be here today. Unfortunately, this year has been so wacky and we can't do events in person, but it also means that we get one-on-one time with Brent. So I feel super fortunate for us to have this class with Brent and get some one-on-one time with him. A little bit about me, if you don't know me, I actually did used to go to Camp Run Amok, just a wee 5 years in a row. And I did do a couple years as what we called the trashies, so the A-team, picking up trash around camp, and I loved it. And I'm really excited because now I work for Four Roses. I've been with Four Roses for about 3 years, and I kind of coupled my love of the bourbon and all the distillery visits and bartending and have created my dream job. So luckily I've been with them, like I said, for about 3 years. I live in the Bay Area, and just super excited to be able to share this with you, both from a bartending point of view and from a bourbon enthusiast point of view. So without further ado, I will welcome Brent Elliott, our Master Distiller of Four Roses. Welcome, Brent.
Thank you, Abby, and thanks, Lindsay, and thanks to all of you for joining in. Got a nice little presentation for you all today. We'll do some tasting, and like Lindsay said, if you have any questions, just send those to her, and I'll be happy to answer as many of those as I can toward the end. So we'll start out, this is about the art of mingling, and something that we really pride ourselves on. Mingling, blending, whatever you want to call it. We tend to call it mingling, and that's sort of, there's a historical context there. It's because historically, for a long time in the U.S., we weren't a straight bourbon whiskey. We were a blended whiskey from the late 50s up until 2002. And so we try to shy away from the term blending because a blended whiskey is clearly much different than a straight bourbon whiskey. It's not subject to the same regulations. You can add color, you can add flavoring, you can add supplemental liquid. There are a lot of things you can do to a blended whiskey. Straight bourbon whiskey, we're very proud of that because it is what it is. It's an all-natural product. So we tend to call it mingling. But what we do, and this is great. So here are the definitions of bourbon, and the not adulterating it is in here, but I'd like to go through some of the guidelines that we have to follow, and every straight bourbon whiskey has to follow to be called a straight bourbon whiskey. The first one is it has to be made with at least 51% corn. And that just makes sense because the grains, of course, impart a lot of the flavor that you're going to get in the final whiskey. And that is the flavor profile of bourbon. It was historically and still is made predominantly with corn. So if you don't use at least 51% corn, it's not going to be bourbon. We have to use new charred oak barrels. And that makes sense because if you use a barrel more than once, you're not going to get the same extracts. You're not going to get the same aging characteristics at the end of the 4, 5, 6, 10 years of aging. It's just not going to be as dark. You're not going to get the barrel flavors, the sweetness. So that's important. And what we typically do with our barrels once we're finished with them is the majority of them from the industry end up in Scotland to age Scotch whiskey. But more and more breweries here in the U.S. and globally are using our barrels for secondary aging for beer. Next one is it has to be distilled at less than 80% alcohol. And that's important because, and as you'll see when I start talking about the mash bills and the grains and the different yeasts, there are a lot of flavors that we try to produce at the front end. And that by the front end of the production, I'm talking about the fermentation. And if you distill too high of a proof, what you're making is vodka or grain neutral spirits. And at those high distillation proofs, you're basically scalping off all those unique flavors that we want to keep in the liquid. Then we also have to put it in the barrel at no more than 125 proof. And that's important because you need a certain amount of water in that barrel to get the right extracts and the right reactions to take place. The next one, as I mentioned, you can't add any flavor, you can't add any color. And this one's important, especially to what I'm going to be talking about today, because part of what makes bourbon so interesting and so unique in the world of mass-produced products is it's impossible to make it perfectly and exactly consistent time after time because there is so much handcraftedness that goes into it. And because you can't adulterate the flavor and color, you're going to have that variation. And there's a lot of science that goes into it, a lot of technology. But if you look at how we make bourbon, it's really relatively unchanged over the last century or so. It's time-honored traditions, it's the same techniques, but we have a lot better control and we have a lot more understanding of what's happening. But regardless of that, there's so many variables that go into it. The grains, the weather, the wood, the warehouses, fermentation profiles, they're just countless variables that can tweak the flavor of what you ultimately get out of any individual barrel. And because of that, we understand, and I think that's great. I think it's great there's some portion that is always kind of in the realm of art. It goes beyond the science, beyond what we understand. So there's always the consideration of the consumer, because we know that if your favorite product, for example, is small batch select or single barrel, that you like it because it has that flavor profile. When you go and you buy it again, you expect the same flavor of liquid. So that's sort of why we originally had the 10 recipes, which I'll get into more. But that gave us control over the final flavor of any one of our products by tweaking the combination or the percentages of the different recipes. The next one is it has to be aged at least 2 years to be called a straight bourbon. If it's aged under 4, you do have to state the age somewhere on the label, which doesn't apply to us because our youngest product is 5 years, at least 5 years. The last one has to be produced in the USA. There's really no scientific reason for that. It's just we created this style of whiskey and we're going to keep it. So next slide, please. So real quick, just a little bit, this sort of captures all of what makes Four Roses unique. First is, of course, we use premium quality grains. Everything we use is non-GMO. This is pretty similar across the industry, hard limestone water. And that's why you see that a lot of very good straight bourbons come out of Kentucky. It's because we have very good water. It's very hard water, and there's plenty of it. There's a lot of running water in the state of Kentucky. And then this is absolutely unique to us. We use single-story brick warehouses. And this is important because when you're aging in a barrel, the biggest factor in how the barrel is going to age, or the whiskey is going to age in the barrel, is temperature. And because temperature rises, if you have a multi-tiered warehouse, you're going to have a larger variation of temperature from the bottom to the top, which isn't necessarily a bad thing for quality. It's just makes it a challenge for consistency. And because we pride ourselves on consistency, and because we control the consistency with the 10 recipes, we don't want that extra layer of variability by having to worry about the characteristics of a barrel that was aged 32 degrees hotter than one on the first floor. So with single-story brick warehouses, we have a more consistent aging. The temperature fluctuation, the temperature variation from the bottom to the top tier is not that great. These are only 6 barrels high. And then onto the real core of how we mingle and what makes us unique, it's our 10 recipes. And the way we achieve that is we start out with 2 mash bills. Both are very high in rye. We have the B mash bill, which is 35% rye, 60% corn, and 5% malted barley. Then we have our lower rye mash bill, which is the E mash bill. It's 20% rye. And that's still high relative to the rest of the industry, but compared to the B mash bill, it is considerably lower. And you should note that at 35% rye, that's about as high as any bourbon you're going to find from a major distillery. And so once we start off with one of those 2 mash bills, either the B or the E, we'll then we mash it, we cool it, we send it to the fermenter, and then we inoculate it with one of 5 different yeast strains. Next slide, please. And each of these strains, these have been selected over the years and isolated because of the different flavors they produce through the fermentation. So each one of these, or during fermentation, essentially what happens with any alcohol production is you introduce yeast, there's a sugar source, and the yeast consumes the sugar, and it creates alcohol, heat, carbon dioxide, and a small portion of other compounds that we refer to as congeners. The congeners are very important because even at small percentages, some of these flavors really come through in the final product. These flavors can range anywhere from fruity, spicy, herbal, floral. And so these particular yeast strains that create these different flavors have been isolated over the years. Now we have 5 that we use. We use the V strain, which creates a delicate fruit, the O strain, which creates a lot of rich fruit, the K, which is light and spicy, the Q, which creates floral flavors and aromas, and the F, which is herbal, sometimes minty, a little phenolic at times, kind of clove-like. So with the 2 mash bills, 5 yeast strains, that's how we arrived at 10 recipes. And each one of these
Brent,
recipes.
Pardon me, with the yeast strains, Brent, what is the history on those? Because I know that we have a kind of a cool history on how they were selected and where they initiated and all that.
Absolutely. That's part of our really the Four Roses history. If you go back before the ownership change, Seagram's was the owner of Four Roses from 1943 up until 2001. And then when they sold off all their brands and their facilities, Kirin, the Japanese beer company, came in and they purchased our distillery, our warehouses, and the brand Four Roses. But prior to that, Seagram's, you all know that company, they produced just about anything you could think of. And they had a huge research department, and they had a lot of focus on consistency, and therefore they focused a lot on yeast because they knew that was probably the best way to control the flavors through all of their different products. And so this was well before my time, but I understand they had a library of 350 plus yeast strains, and they knew the different flavors that each one of those strains would produce. And then depending on the product they were fermenting, whether it was wine, beer, spirits, whatever it was, they had a yeast strain that was perfectly suited to create the right flavors for that product. So through the years, going back to that same time period, Seagram's had 5 different distilleries in the state of Kentucky, all producing straight bourbon whiskey. And it's my understanding that each one of these distilleries focused on one particular recipe or one particular yeast strain. And then over the years, these distilleries were shut down one by one. And we were kind of the last distillery standing out of these Kentucky distilleries. And so to continue producing, in particular, Four Roses bourbon, we had to we had to absorb all 10 recipes or all 5 yeast strains and utilize them with the 2 mash bills. And that was really, we were continuing that tradition or that production method for consistency in this product. And so, but we've now taken it one step further, as you know. In 2004, when we released small batch, that was really the first time in the US market that we looked at those yeast strains and saw some opportunity beyond just the ability to make a consistent product. We realized we had the ability to create completely new products by using different combinations of these different recipes. And that's kind of when the whole small batch concept was born. Next slide, please. So to focus on Four Roses Bourbon, this is the product that you all probably used to know as Yellow Label. It's always just been Four Roses Bourbon, but the label was kind of on the yellow side, so it kind of has the nickname Yellow Label, or had the nickname Yellow Label. But this is a combination of up to all 10 recipes. It is a combination of 5- and 6-year-old bourbons. And sometimes it has older bourbon in it also, because as you all know, there is an aging curve. There's an optimum time for any individual barrel where it's at its peak of maturity. And if you go too far out, you know, for some barrels it's 10 years, for some barrels it's 15, others it's 20. But depending on the different barrels, there's a point where the liquid, the bourbon, starts to become too astringent, too woody. It loses its original vibrant bourbon character. And there's a point where you couldn't even tell what the original spirit was. It's just like extracted wood with alcohol. So occasionally when we have these batches set aside that we let age extended periods of time for potential use and maybe limited editions, sometimes those batches, once they start to go over the hill, we'll take a few of those, and this is where they end up also. But it's really not a significant amount. If you look at the average age of this, it's typically about 5.5 years. It's 80 proof. And for me, what I like about this one, this is kind of one of my summer go-tos, because it's so crisp, it's refreshing. And at this age, at 5.5 average years, it's old enough that you don't get like some of that harsh or that rough new make or white dog character, which isn't bad, but it's a little bit mashy. You get a little bit of the rough grain flavor, and some of that, you know, sometimes if it's a really young whiskey, you can still pick up hints of that. But this one's old enough that you don't pick up any of that raw character, but it's still young enough that you still get all the bright flavors out of the grains, all those bright flavors from all 5 of those yeast strains. I mean, there are hints of floral characteristics, fruit, the spice. It's all in this one. So it's very crisp, very bright, and arguably the most complex of any of these because it does have all 10 of the recipes.
Oh, for sure. And I think this is one of the more popular ones with cocktails too, because it is so versatile and because the proof is a little lower. So, you know, with anything citrus forward, I like it with whiskey smashes, or, you know, sours are really nice with it. And a lot of people have it in their well too, which is awesome to just even get like a highball with this whiskey. So this was one of my favorites too.
Yeah, I get a lot of feedback, especially from bartenders, that they like the extra rye in all of our whiskeys, in particular this one, to be used in the well, because with that extra rye, it seems to hold up very well in cocktails. Mm-hmm. And actually, back when we changed the packaging, we've changed it a few times, but the first time, late, 2008, 2000, it was 2007, 2008. But we were just spreading out. We were starting to get into other states, because when we came back to the U.S., we were just in Kentucky. And then I started in 2005, and at that time, we were still only in Kentucky. And we started adding Indiana, New York, California. We started adding more states. And as people started to try it, in particular bartenders, there was a huge rush or a huge demand for a liter bottle so that we could use it on the back bar. And I still remember Patty, the sales director, she came to us and she said, "We've got to get a liter on the market. And there's so much interest in having this product in bars, but people don't want to put 750s in the well." Mm-hmm. And so we're like, okay, well, it'll probably take 9 months to a year to develop the bottle, develop the molds, vet the packaging, get everything squared away. These things, boring side of the industry. Some of that sometimes takes a long time, and it's not easy.
Yeah.
And she said, we can't wait. She said, we've got to get this on the market right now.
Right.
So if you remember, up until just a few years ago, our leader was in a stock bottle. You know, all of our bottles are very unique. They have rose embossing. They're produced by us. You know, we design them, and they are just 4 roses, except the leader. Well, it is now, but then it's like, don't worry about it. We just need a bottle to put on the market. So we had all these really fancy, you know, customized bottles, and we had just a stock bottle for the leader. And that was really, to your point, it was just because bartenders wanted it on the back bar so much that we heard that demand and we met that. But now it's also, it's similar to this bottle. It's just taller. It has the nice embossing on it.
And now we have a beige label.
Yeah.
But people still call it yellow label. It's fine.
I love the new packaging, and really the idea behind that. And I like the yellow label packaging too, but it really didn't fit into the family of our other products. It was a little more festive. And I didn't really feel like it reflected what was in that bottle. I've always loved this product. It's like I said, it really is unique and it's complex, and I just didn't want it to be underappreciated. And I think the two things about it, the bright yellow label and the screw cap in particular. So we felt that it would be a really nice touch to just update the bottle and, you know, do justice with the packaging to what's in the bottle.
Right.
And so we're very happy with this new package.
And when they went from the blended 4 Roses bourbon to our 10 recipes, when was that?
That was in the transition when Karen bought the company. The Seagram still had 4 Roses blended whiskey on shelves everywhere, typically on the bottom shelf everywhere. You know, it's not a very respected whiskey at that time. Now, back when they released it, it was okay. It was an A blend in the late 50s, but over time, the popularity of it kind of declined, and the quality and the reputation. So we had to overcome it for a long time. You know, that was the perception a lot of people had of 4 Roses, was of that blended whiskey.
Right.
That it wasn't the kind of whiskey you took as a housewarming gift or to a cocktail party. But
you took for yourself to get you through a day, right?
Yeah. You bought it, you kept the brown paper bag on it, and that was.
That's great.
But I should mention too that during that entire period of time, we were a huge brand. We started in 1888. We were sold up to and actually through Prohibition. You could get 4 Roses. It was one of a few bourbons you could get during Prohibition for medicinal purposes. So, and then after Prohibition, we became one of the top selling bourbons in the U.S. You know, we were a huge brand, but then when Seagram's took us off the market and replaced it with the 4 Roses name with a blended whiskey, they took the bourbon and made it export only. Mm-hmm. So during that entire period of time, you could go to Europe or Japan and find 4 Roses anywhere. It was one of the best selling bourbons, and still is, in Europe and Japan. But here in the U.S., we got stuck with the blended whiskey.
And I think we have a bottle in the visitor center, don't we? Or at least an empty bottle of the old label.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A few of those. Yeah. A couple in the archives. And I've had it. It's not, you know, I joke about it. It isn't going to kill you or anything. It's not the worst thing ever, but it's not a straight bourbon whiskey. Blended whiskeys, and they're just lighter. To me, they taste like, whiskey flavored grain neutral spirits. Like I can actually taste like the grain neutral spirits or the vodka behind it. They're so thin. And that was kind of the idea or the reason behind Seagram's decision. At that time, in the late 50s, a lot of people were leaning more towards the lighter spirits, the vodkas and the gins. And so they thought it would be a great business move to capitalize on the name 4 Roses, catch, sort of get in line with the new trend of people going to the lighter spirits, and it stretched the inventory a lot farther.
Right.
Like I mentioned, you could just take a small portion of straight bourbon whiskey and then dilute it with all these other liquids, light whiskey, grain neutral spirits, whatever you could add to bump up that volume, so you could stretch your inventory a lot farther. So that was kind of the thinking behind it at the time.
Yeah.
And So, but I think we've gotten well past that. I remember when I first started, even in '05, I'd go out and do tastings, and I'd be at a table next to Woodford Reserve or Wild Turkey or whoever, and you'd see people sometimes skip past our table and kind of give us a look and maybe say, like they still think that we're that. That's the reputation we had at the time.
Right.
You don't see that too much anymore. I think.
No, I think it's far surpassed. Yeah, for sure.
Back long enough.
More for us anyway, right?
That's right. But so that's why we don't blend our whiskey. We mingle it.
Right. Because of the negative connotation with the blending.
Exactly.
Word. Yeah.
Blending, I think, with all the innovation going on in the industry, it's not, if you look industry wide, it's not really a bad word anymore, because a lot of people are blending, not making a blended whiskey, but blending, more innovative styles of whiskey. It could be, some people are blending straight bourbon whiskeys with straight rye, or, just getting very creative with it. And that's much different than a blended whiskey. So the term blending is starting to take on a different meaning, which is good.
Yeah.
I don't hear many people talk about blended whiskeys anymore. I know they sell very well, but.
Right.
Okay, let's move on to small batch. So this is the one I was mentioning was 2006. Really the first time that we went back to the 10 recipes and created something totally different. Now, at the time, we did have Four Roses bourbon and we did have single barrel on the U.S. market. This was 2006. We were selling maybe 2,000, 3,000 cases. So I don't recall why we thought it was a good idea to expand our portfolio when we were just selling in one state. But I'm glad we did. We had single barrel, which was released in '04, which we'll taste here in a few minutes, which was one recipe, and then the Four Roses bourbon. But we realized there's a lot of opportunity, not only to just give a different product, like a small batch or a different proof or a different age, but it was really an opportunity to go to the 10 recipes and create something different. So what we did was combined both mash bills. So it's 50% high rye and it's 50% low rye. And then it utilizes the K yeast, which is the spicy yeast, and the O yeast, which is rich and fruity. So, and it's 70% of the spicy yeast and 30% of the O. But to me, that O, which creates the rich fruit, it's almost like maraschino cherry and ripe red apple and just ripe fruits. I think that really, to me, defines the aroma and the palate on this. And the spice is there, and you still have a lot of spice from the rye also, but the spice from the yeast and the rye really help to balance out that fruitiness. And with the extra age, this is a combination of 6- and 7-year-old bourbons. You get more of that barrel character, a little more, it's a little denser, has a little bit of a heavier mouthfeel, very nice long finish. But again, for me, it's just that nice fruity edge. And it's not overly fruity. And I think sometimes I want to use the term, syrupy fruit or rich, but I try not to. I know I'm saying it now, but I try not to, because that sometimes gives the impression of something that's overly sweet, but it's not at all. It's just a nice balance. Some that fruit and that some of the caramel and the vanilla and some of that oak sweetness. There's just enough in there to really give it a nice mouthfeel and a nice finish. And it's 90 proof. I didn't mention that.
I think that's why a lot of bartenders like to use it for stirred cocktails. This one in particular, because of the higher proof, going from the yellow label to the small batch. So they can do variations, which are always really nice. But it that mouthfeel, like you're saying. Yeah,
and I think with that extra mouthfeel and that extra gravity in the bourbon, it can influence. I mean, it's more of a player in how you mix it with different cocktail ingredients. So it can help to drive the flavor in different directions. And that's true for all of these. When you look at the single barrel, that's the high rye mash bill. And that works great at 35% rye. A lot of people substitute that in for rye whiskey in different cocktails, because the rye in that one comes through very, very strong, and it's nice, clean rye. I'm getting ahead of myself, but yeah.
Now,
Actually,
with the small batch, Brent, how long did it take for the decision of which bourbons to mingle together to create the small batch product?
that was my first full year at the distillery, and I wish I could say that they included me in the selection process, but I was just learning sensory and barrel selection and that part of my job. But I was fortunate enough to be in the room and to be, they were probably let me vote. They probably didn't count the vote, when we were going through and evaluating everything. But it was a pretty long process. It was, 4 to 6 months probably. Kind of similar to the small batch select. We had plenty of time to work on it and get it just right. So probably in a rush could have been done 2 or 3 months, but we had a lot of time to perfect it and do different test blends and come up with the final recipes. But it's the perfect combination. I love that balance of the fruit and the spice in that one.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that was 2006. Then 2007, we started our limited edition program, and that started with Jim Rutledge's 40th anniversary. And all of you are in the industry, so you probably know Jim Rutledge. He was Mr. Four Roses, so passionate about bourbon, still is. But on his 40th anniversary with the company, we released for the first time a single barrel that was a different recipe. I think it was OESO. And we did like 1,700 bottles. And at the time, the bourbon boom had just really started. So that somehow was enough bottles at the time. So
nowadays it wouldn't be.
I can't imagine that now. So, but that was really, so that sort of piqued people's interest in the different recipes, because then they're like, this tastes different from the other single barrel. What's the difference? Like, well, we use let me tell you, we used a different recipe. And so then the very next year we launched what evolved into the limited edition small batch. At the time it was branded, it was Mariage. It was same package, was single barrel bottle with screen print on the front, just like limited edition, but it was silver. It had a metal cap, and it was called Mariage. We did the Mariage in 2008, 2009, and then in 2010, it evolved into just limited edition small batch. We just decided to call it what it is. A lot of people had, they didn't know if it was Mirage or Marriage or what the Mariage was all about, but the concept remained the same. The concept was, again, just like the small batch that we just tasted. It was to take different recipes and really showcase what we can do by digging into the 10 recipes and selecting a few here and there, doing test blends, finding something that was just very mellow and unique, and then bottling it at barrel strength and non-chill filtered. And then also these products, these are some of the older barrels we have, 10 to, I think the oldest we've used is 23 years old. So we have a lot of barrels sitting aside that are aging very well, that haven't hit that over the hill mark yet, that we every year go and pull from and do test blends and try to create something unique every year. So that's the limited edition small batch, which I think we'll taste at the very end here. So next slide, please. So onto the single barrel, which I kind of talked about a little bit already. So this is one recipe. Now we have our private barrel program also, which is the same package, same concept in that everything in this bottle comes from one barrel. But the difference is this is 100 proof. It's always the same recipe. Private barrel it can be any of the recipes. It's non-chill filtered and it's barrel strength. This one is always at least 7 years of age. It's always the high rye mash bill with the V yeast. Now, if you recall, the V yeast is the delicate fruity yeast, creates flavors more like apricot or green apple, just a little bit lighter than the O yeast strain, not a little more subtle on the fruit. And with the high rye, as I mentioned, to me, that's really the defining flavor. Here, the spice, the rye, is really in the forefront, and that fruitiness kind of creates an undercurrent of just that nice, mellow, balancing fruit. And it's very bright and clean. You get a lot of this one sometimes cinnamon. Of course, a little bit more of the barrel character because this is stepping up in age a little bit from the small batch. But great product, great single barrel, and the other 10 recipes, that's fantastic for us too, because it's not mingling, of course, but it is showing people just the core of our versatility. So we can talk all day about how all of these have the different recipes in them, but it's very interesting for people to get to go out and hunt for these individual recipes and see what we're talking about when we're saying that it's very unique when you take a low rye mash bill and combine it with a floral yeast, because that floral comes through a little bit sweeter, less spicy, and versus the high rye with the spicy yeast that's spice all the way through. So it's really interesting for people to get to try the different individual mingling components that we use.
Are there any yeast strains that, or a yeast strain that you feel that you use less of on its own for any particular reason?
Not really. It seems like in the program, the private barrel program, I haven't really tallied up the numbers, but it seems like it's pretty evenly distributed, what people select. I do remember, like, when we first started the program, the Qs, for example, the only place we used the Qs, and it was true for the Fs too at the time, the only place we used either one of those recipes was in this. And as I mentioned, this is always 5 and 6 year old bourbon. So we didn't have any Qs or Fs that were aged beyond 6 years. And at 5 years, the Q to me is it's all about the aroma, and its flavor is great, but it's kind of one-dimensional. It's that floral nose. It's a little bit candied, but it really isn't as complex as, say, an OBSV at 5 or 6 years. Right. So that one I was a little concerned about. I was thinking, I don't know if people are going to want this Q just standing on its own. It's great, but it's not as balanced. It doesn't have so many layers. And but I was surprised once we started to let the barrels age out to 8, 9, 10 years. And the barrel program is always 8 to 12 year old bourbons. With a little bit of extra age, the Qs turn out fantastic. Because it's really unique, because the complexity you get with age on that, and it's true for all of them, but it's really unique with the Q, because that extra hint of sweetness, the extra caramel, the extra vanilla, those oak characteristics, as those come up, and those very volatile, light, delicate aromas and flavors from the floral, as those come down, they meet and they create just a really nice candied flavor. So that was one I thought wouldn't be able to stand on its own. And at 5 years, that wouldn't be my single barrel of choice. But at 8, 9, 10 years, it really does. It hits that crossroads in its maturity where it really works.
And one of the things I love about the private barrel program, how we do it, is when they come in to taste, we don't tell them which recipes they're tasting. We turn all the barrels around. So no one has any preconceived, mention of, oh, I know I'm going to like this yeast strain. And a lot of people are pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, I think people, when we first started doing that, some people didn't like it, because they're like, I'm here for an OESK or OBSK or whatever it might be. And they wanted to know what they were tasting. But it seems like now everyone really loves the fact that they're testing themselves. And in many cases, they're enlightening themselves, to what they really like. And like you said, they're shutting out those preconceived notions and just going in with a blank palate. So
full blind tasting.
So, but yeah, it works out well and people love it.
What is the average proof of the barrel program bottles? Because you said obviously the single barrel is always 100 proof, but for the cask strength, what would you say is what those are normally kind of come out at, or the range?
I can tell you the range is the highest we've seen something like 137, 138. The lowest, we try not to do any below 100 proof, but there have been some, especially early on, that came in under 100. but typically you're going to see like 105 to 125, maybe 110. Sure. But most often it's in the 108 to 125 range, maybe.
Yeah, that's great.
What's interesting is, back to the single story rick warehouses, there is a temperature variation, even in ours. It's about 7 to 8 degrees on the hottest days here in Kentucky. Even in our warehouses that are pretty consistent, if you go out long enough in age, you'll start to see some differences in characteristics and in proof. And what you can see is if you're buying a private barrel that's, say, 12 years old and it's up there in proof, it's 130, that's probably a 5th or a 6th tier barrel. Right. You get one that's more in the 110 to 115 range, that's probably a 1st or 2nd tier barrel. We find that with the higher heat, just a little bit more heat over that many years,
right,
eventually you start to see a difference. And
that's a good difference.
The gain proof.
Yeah.
And it's all about the heat. The hotter it gets, the more water you lose from the barrel, because water is a smaller molecule, and you get more pressure in that barrel and you lose more of that water, and you concentrate that ethanol, that alcohol up at the top. Okay, speaking of high proof, we're stepping up now to 104. This is something we're super proud of. This is Small Batch Select. We just launched this last year in 5 markets. This year, I believe we added 13. Next year, we'll be adding even more markets. But really, with this one, we realized that, the main thing we realized is that the consumers, especially because of all the great feedback we've gotten from the private selections and the limited editions, people are looking for higher proof bourbons, non-chill filtered bourbons, and we really saw that we had the opportunity to offer something in that range. So what we did is we increased the proof to 104. We decided to do a non-chill filtered bourbon, and of course we wanted to expand on the small batch concept because it's the art of mingling. And we this one I can tell you exactly how long it took because I was obviously involved. For this one, there wasn't really like a start date and an end date. It was kind of like I tinkered with it for a while, but it was, honestly, I can't tell you. I kind of tinkered with it over the course of a whole year. So you could say it could have taken a year, but the amount of time I was seriously like working on the exact test ones, or once I got close, it was a few months, 3 to 4 months probably, there towards the end. But this one was interesting, and it's very similar in how I approach this as like the limited editions. When we're mingling the different recipes for Four Roses bourbon or small batch, there is a target. We want to make sure that it's tasting the same as it tasted last year and 5 years ago. With this one, there is no standard. There is no North Star that says this is the flavor profile. So really with those, you want to make something that's mellow and smooth, that's still within that Four Roses, identity of flavors. But with this, it was really just making something that I liked. And there's really no other guidance that I had. It's like, I'm just going to make something that I really like. And I think I've succeeded at that, at least, because I know that, I would always be asking, what do you drink the most of? And honestly, like, I don't know, I just kind of mix it up. But since we released this, I drink more of this than the other ones. So whether it's because it's new or it's because I made it to my personal taste, I'm not sure what it is, but I really love this one. It's a combination of 6 different recipes. It's both mash bills, and it utilizes the V yeast, the F yeast, and the K yeast. And what's really interesting about this one is both the V yeast and the F yeast. When I'm blending, those are ones that I will pull out of the 10 recipes if I'm looking to increase mouthfeel or to extend the finish, because they're both just very viscous, very rich. And with this one, you've got the F, which creates the unique herbal kind of flavors, kind of minty. And you have the V, which is the same one in the single barrel, which is the delicate fruit. And when you bring those together, and this is something that I learned when we were doing Al's 50th, because Al's 50th, the limited edition, one of the 2 limited editions we did in 2017, that was the first time we used those 2 in combination, the F and the V. They create a very unique flavor. It's it's no fruit known to man, no spice known to man. It's just the sum is so much greater than the sum of the parts, or what you end up with is greater than the sum of the parts. And you add that unique flavor, that minty, fruity type flavor, and then you get that mouthfeel, you get the finish, and then you've got the K in there, which is, again, it's all about balance. It's just enough spice to kind of balance that unique flavor, give it layers of complexity, round it out. And of course, it doesn't hurt that it's 104 proof.
Yeah.
Really gives it a lot of body.
How did you decide on 104 proof for this one?
You'd think that we had, from the beginning, we had a plan to go 104, and it sounds good to say, we're 4 roses, we want 104. I think it was a combination of things. The first thing was we weren't sure, chill filtering, I should talk about that for a second. Chill filtration, pretty much anything under 100 proof or even 100 proof should be chill filtered, because what we're basically doing is we're chilling it down, and we're forcing all the compounds that are in solution with alcohol to come out of solution, and we filter them out. All these compounds that come from the plants or the grains in the wood, they're soluble at high alcohol percentages. That's why limited editions, private selections, none of those have to be chill filtered. But we didn't really know exactly what that breaking point was, if it would be stable at 100, 101, 102, 103, 104. So early on, before we'd even decided really to launch this product, when we were just in the development stages, we decided to just run a test with some 104 proof bourbon. We sort of picked a number, like, let's go with 104. Let's put that in the freezer and make sure it's stable, make sure it doesn't get cloudy over the course of a few months. And so that was kind of where we started. And of course, it was stable. And then when I started doing the test blends, I started doing all those at 104, and still thinking we might tweak it, we might change it. But something about the 104, even after I finalized this formula, tried, because I personally like my favorite proof, and there are exceptions to everything, but I really like 107, 108. That really, for me, in most cases, is the sweet spot for my preference. But with this one, tried different levels of the same 6 recipes at 104. I can't remember the different ranges I did, but several test ones. And something about 104, probably because it was created at 104, to that proof, but that was really the preferred. It was just so mellow, so smooth, still had enough body that you could, everything that I mentioned before, all those attributes were just perfect. But this, and I see this with some other whiskeys too that we put out, or anyone else, you start going up really high in proof, all the flavors are still there, but it's almost like it's such a high proof, they're so concentrated, you can't sort through them all. They're kind of all bound together, and they're so tightly bound that your palate can't really break every little flavor, every little nuanced flavor down, especially in a super complex whiskey. And that's why too, we'll say for at any proof, add a little bit of water, and you'll see it unfold. You'll see whiskey can change dramatically if you drop it 10 degrees in proof, or even with just a couple of drops. And I think that's a lot of what's happening. You volatilize some of those flavors, but you're also sort of taking that edge off and sort of unlocking some of those flavors that are so tightly bound at those high proofs. So I think that's probably what was kind of happening here. And 104 just ended up being the sweet spot for Select.
Yeah.
Take one more sip of that one before we move on to the last one.
So good.
And this, what I was talking about earlier, this is the limited edition 2020. Again, we do this every year. We typically release it in Kentucky in September. I know other states don't get it in September, but hopefully everyone has them in their markets now, has this in their markets now. But concept of this, same as a small batch, just every year using different batches, older whiskey, try to make something totally unique. And that's, you want to make it unique and you want to make it good. Those are really, and again, good here is kind of subjective. So it's to make it, within the Four Roses family, it's got to be mellow, smooth, easy to drink, not too oaky. That's always a challenge because I know, there are some people that love a lot of oak. I personally like, and I think we really achieved it in this one. I like it when there's enough oak that there's some old whiskey in there. It gives you that impression of extra aged, elegant whiskey, but it's not so much that it starts to become astringent or flat or too oaky, or that oak will overtake some of those more delicate flavors that you get, the fruits, the spice, all the flavors. Next slide, please. Okay, so this one is a combination of, it's 4 different recipes. It's a 12-year-old OBSV, 12-year-old OESV, 19-year-old OESK, and a 19-year-old OBSK and a 16-year-old OESK. So these are all batches that we probably have 20, 25 of these batches set aside because they were aging so well, because they were not getting overly oaky, or they might have been even developing new and unique flavors. So these batches were all set aside. And then for these typically take about 2 or 3 months of test blending to come up with the final formula. But this one, I'm super happy with this one. It's kind of everything I just said about the balance between the oak and everything else. I think we really achieved that with this one. It's got a lot of complexity. You don't lose any of those vibrant characters that you get from some of the, I hate to say younger because the youngest one in here is a 12-year-old. But you don't lose any of those vibrant, those rich, bright characteristics of the OBSV, the OESV. But it's nicely balanced with that 19-year-old batch. And I'll tell you, any one of these batches could have been a single barrel. Maybe the 19-year-old OBSK, it could have been, but it wouldn't have. I don't think everyone would have liked it. It's a little bit oaky. It has a few hints of the flatness, like it was kind of starting to, I don't know, water down or subdue some of the brighter characteristics of that it probably had when it was a 16 or 15-year-old bourbon. But it was very elegant. The oak, there's still some spice. I mean, all those characteristics were really good, but the challenge there was to mingle this so that you could pull out all those good characteristics and kind of blend out the older characteristics. And so for all of you that have this one, cheers. Let's have a sip of it.
Absolutely. One thing how I kind of explained it to myself really when I was learning about all of our different bourbons and mingling, not having a background in distillation or chemistry, I really took it as my experience behind the bar and building a cocktail, and that it's so much easier to just pour a whiskey neat or anything on the rocks versus creating a cocktail that has all these different elements and is well balanced and kind of leaves you wanting more. And I feel like that's one thing about our bourbons that really excites me, is that it's so many different bourbons and so many different flavor profiles, but they come together to create this wonderful cocktail of bourbons, essentially.
That's funny you should say that, because I never really thought about, I've never considered myself a good bartender. I can whip up some, very basic cocktails, but I enjoy doing it. But I've had conversations with bartenders kind of like this, where I'm talking about the blending, the balance, and then they start talking and they're saying the exact same thing. They approach it the exact same way that I approach the mingling. It's just working with different ingredients.
Right.
A wider range of ingredients for a bartender, and 10. Well, I say 10 recipes, but we also, especially when we start looking at these older products, you do have the extra dimension of different ages and stuff. So it gets a lot more complex. More complex than 10 recipes, not more complex than having an infinite number of different ingredients at your disposal.
Yeah.
But it's the same approach exactly. And that's what I always say when I'm doing these limited editions, because each one of, what the different ingredients are, on the back bar. You're very familiar with each one of those. So it makes it easy. If you taste the cocktail, you can say, oh, it's too much of that, or it needs more of that, because you know all those tools. You're familiar with all those tools. Each year when it comes time to do this limited edition, it's an all new set of tools. So I usually spend about 2 weeks just going through all those batches and learning what each one tastes like, getting very familiar with each one of those with a lot of notes, just a lot of revisiting the same batches again and again. And then to simplify things, I usually pare it down to maybe 10 batches, 5 to 10 different batches. And then usually spend another few days just getting more familiar with each one of those. And then I start building on it.
Right.
I know the first time I did a limited edition on my own, that was the mistake I made. I got excited and I started, the first day I was smelling the different batches and was like, this is going to be great with this one. This is going to be no problem. I started throwing things together and, it wasn't bad, but then it's like, well, it's not perfect, but how did I get here?
Right.
And I couldn't really mentally deconstruct it because I wasn't familiar with everything that went into it.
Right.
So I could say maybe it needs a little bit more of this or a little bit more of that. I'm like, well, great. How do you achieve that? So that's really part of what I've learned in all the mingling and blending that I do is just being very familiar with what you're working with to know when you start going down that path of test blends. And it gets, sometimes for these limited editions, it's 30, 40, 50, 60 test blends.
Yeah.
And, it's different directions that get explored. Sometimes I'll have the batches will give me an idea and I'll head in that direction. Sometimes I'll try to head in that direction and the batches will take us somewhere else, because of unique combinations, kind of like the F and the V, You taste the F, a 12-year-old batch of F or a 6-year-old batch of F yeast and 6-year-old batch of OESV, and you think, let's put these together and you imagine what it's going to taste like. You're wrong. It's going to be.
And then going to how many, like the percentage of each that you're going to put in the final product as well.
Oh yeah. And you start out just like sculpting with a big lump of clay. You start out with just sort of a raw form. And then as I get closer, or might start with a few different raw forms. And at some point it's like, I think I like this one the best. And then so start really fine tuning it, and the hardest part's knowing when to stop because you could go on forever. You can always make it better. And that's something that's hard because every time I walk away and I'm like, okay, this is it. Let's release this.
Yeah.
Every time.
I know the beautiful mind, just like all of a sudden you're like, wait, where am I?
Yeah. How'd I get here? And I was like, I can keep going, this could end up, but
well, I think it always works out. I think, and most will agree, I think you succeeded and all of our products are just beautiful expressions.
Well, thank you, Abby. Cheers.
Cheers.
But anyway, that was that's the art of mingling at Four Roses.
Well, fantastic. Thank you both so much. I do have a couple of questions for you, Brent and Abby, if you don't mind.
Not a
get
bit.
A couple of questions from those in the comments. The first one is, how many barrels make up the small batch?
Good question. The first time we did it, it was 17 barrels. We had the formula, so many percentage of each one. That was 2006. It sold so well that the very next month we had to bottle it again and we had to double it. We've done that several times. Now we're up to probably as high as we're going to get, which is between 200 and 300 barrels a dump on average. What we're doing is we're still sticking with the same proportions of each recipe. And so there's no legal definition for small batch. It's all relative. A super small batch for us could be a huge batch for a micro distillery. And our biggest batch could be a small batch for a distillery bigger than us.
Right.
So it's all kind of relative. So it's hard to really define by a volume what it is. So sort of our take on small batch, or the way we approach it, is any of the small batch products have that extra degree of handcraftedness in selecting the batches, doing the test blends, and selecting sort of the batches that really fit into that profile.
Absolutely. You mentioned that small batch is 50-50 B to E and 70-30 K to O. does Select also have a 50-50 mash bill ratio? And what is the YFK yeast breakdown? We're going to leave Jay's question up there so you have all of those details in front of you.
Okay, gotcha. Good question. No, that one is not 50-50. It's a little bit higher on the rye side. Can tell you off the top of my head what the exact proportion is. And the biggest proportion of this one is the V, then the F, and then the K.
Excellent. And then our very last question here is, what percentage of E to B mash bill and V to K yeast is in the 2020 LE?
Okay. Off the top of my head, can we go back to the slide that had the breakdown? I'm probably going to be wrong. I'm probably going to be wrong about this, but I can tell you that the 19-year-old OBSK was, our target was 20%, and we ended up, when we dumped it, it was 19%. I think the other ones were split somewhat evenly. They were somewhere between the 20 and 30% range for the OBSV, the OESV, and the OESK. But it's out there. It might be on our website.
Baker, what we're going to do is we're going to find out, and I'm going to get back to you because that's a great question. We want to make sure we get it right. So
I could have told you exactly 2 months ago, right after we dumped it, but it's been a little while. But I do remember that.
Brent, I have no idea how you keep all those numbers in your head.
I know.
It is mind-blowing to me how you just pull these numbers out of your head, because I barely know my own phone number, never mind all of these numbers that you're spitting out here. So we'll make sure we double check that info and get back to everybody.
And if you can't find it, email me. I'll pull that up.
Amazing. Well, thank you both so much for all of your time today. It was, as always, such a treat to get to learn from the master. So thank you. Thank you. We really do appreciate y'all. And we are going to be back again tomorrow with another Brown and Balanced. Our featured bartender is Omar Yufun, who I love. And I'm so excited to have everybody back with us again tomorrow. If you haven't already, make sure that you go and like Portland Cocktail Liqueur on Facebook or on YouTube so that you're up to date on all of the really fun programming we have coming up. You never want to miss an hour with Brent Elliott telling you how he makes whiskey. I'm telling you that right now, but I have a feeling you all know that. So if you want to make sure that you're here every time we get amazing people like Brent to come talk to us, please make sure you're liked and subscribed on all of these. Well, thank y'all so much, and I will see everybody back here on Friday. Bye, y'all. Have a great night.
Thank you.